Do you ever feel like when you play in a big reverberant space that your sound just flows? But when you get back to your practice space and the room isn't quite so forgiving, things can get a little complicated. Today, we're talking about how the rooms that we practice and perform in impact our perception of our playing and what to do about it. What's up, everyone? Today is going to be a short and sweet one. This is essentially a sound lesson with a little side note on acoustics. To kind of explore some of these concepts, we're going to hear some examples in 3 different spaces. To start out with, just here in my studio that you hear me all the time. Next, that same studio space with no acoustic treatment. And finally, in my living room with a 12-foot ceiling. These 3 spaces are going to give us some insight as to how we as brass players perceive our sound in different rooms. The feedback that we get from the rooms that we practice and perform in can play tricks on our sensibilities as brass players. So, to start with, we're here in my studio space. This is a room I built specifically to record in, to practice in, to teach in. One thing that I found though, because it is a relatively dry acoustic room, because I have quite a bit of sound absorption in here, it can be a little challenging to practice in, especially the first couple weeks when I was practicing in this space. Man, I was having a hard time just getting sound going. I was finding I was forcing my sound because there was just no reverberation, sort of like reinforcing what I was hearing. Now, on the flip side of that, once I got used to practicing in this space, I found that it's actually done really good things for my sound because you hear everything. There's nothing there sort of covering up little inconsistencies in tone, maybe little places where you might realize, oh, I'm actually playing quite tense. I can hear it in my sound, whereas in a big reverberant space, you wouldn't necessarily hear those type of details. Now, our second example, the same room, untreated, this is probably most similar to the space that most of us are practicing. In all honesty, I'm not 100% sure what it's going to sound like as I'm recording this. I'll have to listen back afterwards as I'm editing this together. I haven't played in this room with no sound treatment on it, aside from a very small amount when I first finished the space. In rooms like this, where there's sort of less than ideal reverberations happening, there's a lot of reflections off of all these flat surfaces. This room is very rectangular and has a relatively low ceiling. These are not good qualities for a room like sounding good, quote unquote. So we are probably not getting a very realistic picture of our sound when we practice in rooms like this. It's going to be a lot of what we might call masking of certain elements of our sound and maybe exaggerating of other elements of our sound. So it can just give us sort of a false sense of really where we are on this element of our playing. Now, our third space, my living room, on days when I'm maybe feeling like, man, the sound just isn't working or things are sort of feeling clogged up, I will go practice for maybe 15 minutes or so in my living room where it's a lot liver of a space. There's just a lot more reverb because it's a tall ceiling, it's a larger room, and that can kind of help me feel confident in my sound because some of those small details that don't sound as much as maybe I want them to, I don't hear them as much when there's a lot more reverb. So a larger room like that can really help you to feel like there's easy flow, which then you can carry over maybe when you're in your normal practice space. So just to hear each one of these spaces with a little more detail, I composed a little etude that I'm going to play in each room. I'm not going to play with a click track. I am going to check it with a metronome so I can easily go between the different takes. I'm going to minimally process this. There'll be no reverb, just a little bit of sort of generic EQ and a very small amount of compression, so that way it all sounds sort of nice and even. But other than that, there's going to be no processing, so you can really hopefully hear the difference between the rooms. Like I said, I'm not totally sure, particularly how this second example is going to sound, because I've never recorded in a space like this. But let's give this a try. We'll shuffle through each one so you can kind of hear the differences and then talk about what we do with this information. So when we're playing in those different spaces, whether that be practice or performance, it can sometimes cause a domino effect in our playing. Maybe we are playing in a space we're not used to. Our sound doesn't feel like it normally does. It doesn't sound like it normally does. In all actuality, it probably sounds pretty similar out front, but what we perceive feels different. That can cause a domino of things to happen where we start to force, maybe we start to overplay, maybe we start to underplay. There's all sorts of things that can happen. In order to sort of ensure that we don't fall into that trap, there are 3 steps that I want you to think about when you are working on your sound, regardless of which space you are working in. The first, and by far the most important thing that you need to do, is you need to have a clear mental image of what your sound should sound like, or what you want it to sound like might be a better way of putting that. So this is classic Arnold Jacobs sort of thought process. He talks about, and I'm paraphrasing here, that there are 2 musicians. There's sort of the external musician that's like operating your instrument, but the by far more important musician is the one that is in your head, the one that is hearing the music, hearing your sound. If that is not developed, no amount of long tones, no amount of buzzing, no amount of air is going to help your sound be great. You have to have a mental image of what that is. One of the ways I like to work on this with students, just kind of get the ideas sort of established, is think about some adjectives that could describe your sound. I love words that are maybe a little subjective, almost vague in this sense, so there's a little bit of room for interpretation. A lot of people would talk about a dark sound, a warm sound, a full sound, a round sound, all this stuff. These are all good words. There's not a right or wrong answer here. The one that's at the top of my list for myself, and what I always try to get people thinking about, is the term clarity. To me, I want my sound to have clarity. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's just like a little like ringing bell all the time. Sometimes I maybe want a little bit of grease on it or a little bit of air in it, but there is clarity with that intention of the sound. The second element that I would focus on when we're thinking about these issues of sound is striving for a consistent sound over a quote unquote good sound. When we think about a good sound, we get very caught up in sort of like what we're hearing out in front of us rather than what we're hearing in our head. And so, like I said, the room is going to play tricks on you. Maybe you're at one day playing in a nice reverberant concert hall, playing acoustic music, everything feels nice. Maybe the next day you're playing on a rock band gig and you're playing through a monitor and the monitor engineer has no idea what a trombone should sound like. That's going to give your ear incredibly disparate ideas about what the sound that you're creating is. So you need to strive for thinking about consistency rather than thinking about, is it good? The third and final element of developing a great sound, regardless of what space you're playing in, is feeding your ear with great sounds. For me, as a trombone player, it's all about J.J. Johnson and Steve Davis. They are the center points of my sound. And I really think that regardless of who you are, you should start with your own instrument for developing your sound. Now, if you're a trombone player, they might be different players, but you want to have sort of a core of your instrument. From there, you can branch out to other instruments to sort of fill in the gaps or kind of influence some of the edges of your sound. So for example, for me, I love Roy Hargrove's sound. It's got like a lot of stuff in it, a lot of different elements, a lot of different directions he can go. And that is what I want to get in my playing. So if I'm really trying to inform my sound, it's all about listening to this small handful of people and just feeding that into my ear, not thinking about I'm trying to change my sound or necessarily sound like that, just getting that to create the mental image and then hearing those things in my head as I'm playing long tones, as I'm playing lip slurs, as I'm playing kind of anything, in all honesty. All right, that's it for today. Remember, your sound is not changing that much from space to space. Your perception of it might be changing as sort of the rooms around you change, but what actually is coming out of your bell is remarkably similar regardless of those different spaces. So if you invest the time in things like long tones, in things like lip slurs, and things maybe like mouthpiece buzzing and breathing, and you focus on that internal voice of what does my instrument sound like, you'll sound great regardless of what room you're in. All right, see you in the woodshed.